What was life really like for a woman in 825, deep in the heart of the Carolingian Empire? Could you survive a single day in her worn shoes, enduring relentless toil from sunup to sundown? Prepare to step back in time and uncover the grueling truths of daily existence for serf women, far from any gilded hall or quiet study. Number 7. The unyielding soil and the hands that tamed it. Imagine waking before the sun has even thought about stretching its first golden fingers across the eastern sky. The air in your small, smoky hut is damp and cold, carrying the earthy scent of straw and the faint, ever-present tang of wood smoke. Your limbs ache before they even begin to move, a constant companion to the life you lead. It is 825 and the fields are calling. For a serf woman, the earth was not just ground beneath her feet. It was a demanding master, a fickle provider, and the ultimate arbiter of survival. While often thought of as a man's domain, the fields consumed the energy and attention of women with equal, if not greater, ferocity. Their labor in the vast agricultural landscape was a cornerstone of the Carolingian economy, a silent, back-breaking testament to resilience. When the spring thaw finally loosened the stubborn grip of winter, signaling the time for sowing, the ground transformed into a battlefield. Women would be out there, often barefoot or in crude, leather-bound shoes, their toes sinking into the muddy furrows. The soil, still heavy with the recent snowmelt, clung stubbornly, demanding immense physical effort with every step. Seeds, precious and life-giving, were often carried in a pouch slung over a shoulder or held in the apron. With rhythmic practice movements, hands would plunge into the earth, carefully placing each tiny grain of wheat or barley, each pea or bean, into its designated spot. This was not a quick task completed by machine. It was an intimate, painstaking conversation with the soil, requiring thousands upon thousands of repetitions under a sky that could turn from benign to brutal in an instant. A sudden spring shower could turn the finely prepared earth into a quagmire, making every step a struggle against suction and slippery footing. Historians studying the Carolingian era often emphasized the vital role of manual labor in agriculture. Without it, there was no food, no sustenance, no life. The women were an integral part of this foundational work. As the sun climbed higher, casting a stark, unforgetting light on the open fields, the back-breaking work of weeding would begin. This wasn't merely about tidiness. It was about survival. Every weed was a thief, stealing precious nutrients and water from the vulnerable young crops. Imagine crawling along endless rows, sometimes on hands and knees, sometimes hunched over a crude hoe or even just a sharpened stick clutched in your hand. The sun would beat down on your exposed neck, sweat trickling into your eyes, stinging. Your hands would be raw and calloused, stained dark with earth. Hours would melt into an indistinguishable blur of pulling, tugging, and hacking at persistent invaders like thistles and bindweed. The repetitive motion, the constant stooping and rising, placed incredible strain on the lower back and shoulders. For women, this task was particularly common, often undertaken with children strapped to their backs or playing nearby, learning the grim reality of their future from a young age. Contemporary agrarian texts, while sparse, sometimes hint at the differentiation of tasks, yet the overarching truth is that everyone, regardless of gender, worked the land. Then came the harvest, the culmination of months of ceaseless effort, and perhaps the most demanding period of all. Late summer and early autumn saw the fields shimmer with golden wheat or rippling oats, but this beauty belied the immense labor required to bring in the bounty. Women, often alongside men, would wield sickles, their curved blades flashing in the sunlight. The motion was a constant, repetitive swing. Grasp a handful of stalks, slice them clean, then gather them into bundles. The straw was sharp, cutting into hands and arms, leaving behind a trail of itchy welts and scratches. The heat of late summer could be oppressive, shimmering waves rising from the sun-baked earth, making every breath feel thick and heavy. Dehydration was a constant threat, and water, fetched from a distant well, was a precious commodity. The work lasted from dawn until dusk, often extending into the twilight as the desperate need to bring in the harvest before rain or rot set in drove everyone to their limits. Accounts of manorial life, pieced together from administrative records and fragments of contemporary letters, paint a picture of communities mobilized for this critical period, with women playing a foundational role in the cutting and binding of sheaves. Beyond the major grain harvests, serf women were also deeply involved in the cultivation of legumes, like peas and beans, which were crucial protein sources, and vegetables like cabbage and root crops. These smaller, more intricate tasks often involved even more bending and kneeling, cultivating small plots by hand. The effort was continuous. There was no off-season for the earth. Even in winter, when the ground was frozen, women might be involved in clearing brush, mending fences, or preparing tools for the next growing season. All tasks that required physical strength and endurance. The simple act of walking to and from the fields, often miles from their humble dwellings, added significant mileage and weariness to their already overburdened bodies. Connection between a serf woman and the soil was profound, shaped by an intimate knowledge of its rhythms and demands. She understood the subtle changes in the weather, the texture of the earth beneath her fingers, the health of a sprouting shoot. This was not abstract labor. It was a direct interaction with the source of life itself. The success or failure of the harvest meant the difference between a meager existence and outright starvation for her family. There were no safety nets, no government subsidies, only the sweat of her brow and the bounty of the earth. Constant risk of crop failure, due to drought, flood, or pestilence, added a layer of pervasive anxiety to the physical burden. Each year was a gamble, each crop a desperate hope. The very ground she tilled was not her own. It belonged to the lord of the manor, to whom she owed a portion of her labor and her harvest. This feudal obligation meant that even her most exhausting efforts were not solely for her family's benefit, but also served to enrich the powerful few. This added a psychological weight to the already immense physical demands. The unyielding soil truly shaped her life, demanding ceaseless labor, offering meager reward, yet holding the very essence of survival in its depths. Number 6. The whispers of the loom and the endless thread step away from the sun-baked fields and into the dim, often smoky interior of a serf woman's dwelling. Here, another relentless labor awaited a task that transformed raw materials into the very fabric of their existence: textile production. In 825, and every stitch of clothing, every blanket, every piece of sackcloth was born from human hands, and those hands predominantly belonged to women. This wasn't merely a craft, it was a fundamental pillar of household economy and survival, consuming countless hours, often stretching late into the night. The rhythmic hum of the spinning wheel and the clack of the loom were the constant soundtrack to a serf woman's life, a testament to her unending industriousness. The journey from fleece to fabric began long before the loom. It started with the sheep, often sheared in late spring or early summer. While men might handle the shearing of large flocks, women were typically responsible for the painstaking preparation of the raw wool. Imagine sitting on the ground, surrounded by piles of greasy, dirt-laden fleece, filled with burrs and tiny bits of straw. Each handful had to be meticulously picked over, impurities removed, a process known as skirting or cleaning. This was dirty work, leaving hands sticky and smelling of lanolin. Then came the washing, often done in cold streams or large vats of heated water, using lye made from wood ashes to strip away the grease. The wool then had to be carefully dried, usually spread out on bushes or racks, constantly monitored to prevent mildew or animal interference, This seemingly simple step was crucial. Improperly cleaned wool would lead to weak, brittle thread. Medieval inventories and monastic records, which sometimes describe the economic activities of estates, frequently mention the presence of significant numbers of sheep and the associated production of wool in its processing. This involved carding, a process that untangled and aligned the fibers, making them ready to be drawn into thread. Imagine two wooden paddles, studded with rows of wire teeth. You'd take a handful of fluffy wool, place it on one carder, and then use the other to comb through it, gently pulling the fibers apart and then aligning them into a soft, cloud-like roll, called a rolle or bat. This required a delicate touch. Too much pressure could break the fibers. Too little would leave them tangled. The repetitive motion, the dust and tiny fibers filling the air, could lead to respiratory issues over time. It was a chore that could be done almost anywhere, by the hearth, outside in the sun or during brief moments of rest, but it was always there, waiting to be done. Then came the spinning, the heart of textile production. For centuries, this was done with a drop spindle, a simple stick with a weighted whorl. Later, in the Carolingian period, simple spinning wheels began to appear, greatly increasing efficiency, though the spindle remained common. Whether with a spindle or a wheel, the process required incredible dexterity and coordination. A woman would take a rollage of wool, attach a few fibers to the spindle or wheel's hook, and then with one hand draft or pull out a consistent stream of fibers while the other hand kept the spindle twirling or the wheel turning. The goal was a thin, even thread, strong enough to withstand the rigors of weaving. This was a skill learned from childhood, practiced tirelessly until the movements became fluid and automatic. Hours upon hours were spent at this task, often in poor light, straining the eyes. A single garment could require miles of spun thread. Imagine the endless repetition, the feeling of the raw wool passing through your fingers, slowly transforming into something useful. The importance of this labor is underscored by the very term spinster, originally a disgrappa for an unmarried woman who made her living by spinning. This wasn't just a leisure activity, it was essential production. Once enough thread had been spun, it was time for weaving, arguably the most complex and time-consuming part of textile production. The loom itself, whether a simple warp-weighted loom or a more complex horizontal ground loom, was a significant piece of household equipment, often dominating the limited space in the dwelling. Setting up the loom was a labor in itself, involving carefully arranging hundreds, sometimes thousands of warp threads to create the foundation of the fabric. This process was precise and demanding, requiring patience and a keen eye. A single mistake could unravel hours of work. Then, with the shuttle flying back and forth, carrying the weft thread through the warp, the fabric slowly, painstakingly grew. The rhythmic clack of the loom, the tension in the threads, the focused gaze of the weaver. It was a symphony of creation. The scale of this labor was immense. A family might need several tunics, cloaks, and blankets each year, all hand-spun and hand-woven. Consider the sheer volume of thread required for a single tunic, then multiply that by the needs of a growing family over a lifetime. This constant demand meant that textile production was not a seasonal chore, but an ongoing daily commitment, often performed in the scant hours between other equally demanding tasks. The loom was never truly quiet for long. Dyeing the cloth, if desired, was another complex process, involving gathering plants and minerals, preparing dye baths, and carefully immersing the fabric to achieve the desired color. The knowledge of these natural dyes, passed down through generations, was another aspect of a woman's expertise. The quality of the textile produced was a source of pride and an indicator of a woman's skill. Well-made cloth was durable, warm, and protected against the harsh Carolingian elements. Poorly made cloth would wear out quickly, leaving a family vulnerable. Beyond mere utility, Textile production also fostered a sense of community. Women often gathered to spin or weave, sharing stories, gossip, and teaching younger generations the intricate skills. It was a space for camaraderie, even amidst the arduous labor. But even within these moments of shared activity, the underlying truth remained. This was ceaseless, essential work, literally weaving the thread of existence, one painstaking yard at a time. The whispers of the loom spoke of dedication, of necessity, and of the profound contribution of serf women to the very fabric of their society. Number 5. The harsh demands and the endless hunger. The crackling fire in the central hearth was more than just a source of warmth in a Carolingian serf's dwelling. It was the heart of the home, the indispensable engine of daily life, and its constant demands fell heavily upon the shoulders of women. From dawn till dusk, and often long into the night, the tasks of food preparation and preservation consumed a massive portion of a serf woman's day in 825 AD. The endless hunger of her family, coupled with the seasonal abundance and scarcity of foodstuffs, dictated a relentless rhythm of labor, transforming raw ingredients into meager but vital sustenance. This was not cooking for pleasure or variety. It was cooking for survival, a constant battle against spoilage and starvation. The day often began with the fundamental task of grinding grain. Imagine standing or kneeling over a cornerstone, two heavy stones, one stationary base and one rotating upper stone with a central hole. With a sturdy wooden handle, you would push and pull the upper stone in a circular motion, dropping handfuls of dried grain into the hole. The work was monotonous, physically demanding, and dusty. The rhythmic scraping of stone on stone, the fine flour dust settling on your clothes and in your hair, the ache in your arms and shoulders. This was the daily grind, quite literally. A family's bread supply for a day might require hours of this work, and for larger communities, millstones often owned by the lord offered a faster, though still laborious alternative, typically requiring a portion of the flour as payment. But for many, the hand quern was the only option, a testament to the sheer physical effort required to turn grain into something edible. This was a chore that could not be skipped. Without flour, there was no bread, and without bread, there was no life. Archaeological findings of quern stones in domestic sites throughout Europe from this period confirm their widespread use and the daily dedication to this task. Once the flour was ground, the serious business of baking bread began. In many serf households, a small oven might be built into the hearth, or a shared communal oven used typically once or twice a week. But daily baking meant simple, unleavened flatbreads cooked directly on the coals or in a shallow pan over the fire. This required careful management of the heat, a keen eye to prevent burning, and constant tending. Imagine the heat from the open flame, the smoke stinging your eyes, as you knead the rough dough, shaping it, and then carefully placing it onto the hot stones or embers. The smell of baking bread, though often the simple coarse rye or barley loaf, was a rare comfort in the otherwise harsh reality. Beyond bread, the daily cooking revolved around whatever meager provisions were available. Pottage, a thick stew made from grains, legumes, and whatever vegetables or wild greens could be gathered, was a staple. This required constant tending of the fire, keeping the pot simmering for hours, stirring to prevent sticking, and adding ingredients as they became available. Imagine the intense heat of the hearth, the perpetual worry about running out of fuel, the watchful eye on the precious food simmering over the flames. Meat was a rare luxury, often only available after a hunt or a communal slaughter. But when it was, it required careful preparation, often boiled or roasted over the fire. The scarcity meant every scrap was used, from offal to bone marrow. Preservation was as crucial as cooking, a desperate race against the clock to prevent food from spoiling in a world without refrigeration. After harvest, women would be engaged in frenetic activity. Grains and legumes had to be dried thoroughly and stored in cool, dry places to prevent mold and pests. Vegetables like cabbages and root crops would be stored in root cellars or buried in pits to keep them fresh through winter. Fruits, when available, would be dried in the sun or over a low fire. Imagine slicing apples or berries, thinly spreading them out on mats, constantly turning them to ensure even drying, all while swatting away insects. Meat, if a family was fortunate enough to acquire some, presented a particular challenge. Smoking and salting were the primary methods of preservation. This involved carefully salting the meat, then hanging it in the smokehouse or near the chimney, where the perpetual smoke from the hearth would slowly cure it. This process was lengthy and meticulous. Too little salt and the meat would spoil. Too much and it would be unpalatable. The air in these smoky environments was thick and acrid, contributing to persistent coughs and eye irritation. These tasks often required women to work well into the night, using the flickering light of the hearth or a crude tallow lamp, pushing their bodies to the absolute limits of exhaustion. The Carolingian capitularies, administrative decrees like the Capitulare Divius, offer glimpses into the expected provisions and foodstuffs of estates, indirectly illustrating the scope of food preservation activities that would have fallen to women. Even the simple act of fetching water for cooking was a significant daily chore. Wells were often distant, and rivers or streams could be even further. Imagine hauling heavy wooden buckets, often several trips a day through mud or snow, up hills and across uneven terrain. This physical burden was compounded by the knowledge that contaminated water could bring sickness and death. Every element of food preparation, from fetching the water to tending the fire, from processing the raw ingredients to preserving the bounty, was physically demanding and mentally taxing, a continuous struggle against the elements and the relentless march of time. The demands of the hearth were not just about warmth. They were about survival, about feeding hungry mouths, and about ensuring that enough food was stored to ward off the ever-present specter of famine. The hands that prepared these meager meals were calloused, burned, and tirelessly engaged in a struggle for existence that never truly ended. Number 4. The endless thirst and the gathering of warmth beyond the ceaseless demands of the hearth and the fields. Serf women in 825 AD faced another set of fundamental, non-negotiable daily labors: the relentless pursuit of water and the constant gathering of fuel. These were not glamorous tasks, nor were they tasks that ended once completed. They were a perpetual cycle, critical for every aspect of life, from cooking and cleaning to simply surviving the harsh Carolingian winters. The physical toll of these daily expeditions was immense, shaping the very gait and endurance of every woman in the village. Imagine waking up to the chill morning air inside your dwelling. One of the first thoughts, even before considering breakfast, would be the water supply. Water was not piped into homes. It had to be fetched often from a communal well, a nearby spring, or a river that might be a significant distance away. Picture yourself carrying heavy wooden buckets, sometimes 2 at a time, their weight pulling at your arms and shoulders with every step. The path to the water source was rarely a smooth, well-trodden road. It could be muddy after rain, slick with ice in winter, or uneven and rocky. Each trip was an exercise in endurance and balance, especially if you had a child strapped to your back or a younger sibling trailing behind. The sheer volume of water needed for a family was staggering. Water for drinking, for cooking, for washing bodies and clothes, for feeding animals. A single family could easily require dozens of liters a day, translating into multiple taxing trips. For a woman who bore the primary responsibility for domestic tasks, these journeys were a constant feature of her daily routine. The well itself could be a center of social interaction, a brief moment to exchange news or gossip, but the underlying purpose was always the same: hard, physical labor. The ropes used to draw water from deep wells could chafe hands, and the full buckets once retrieved were dead weights, needing to be carefully carried without spilling. The vulnerability of water sources to contamination was also a constant worry, adding another layer of silent anxiety to the physical burden. Contaminated well could bring illness and death to an entire community. Historical accounts, such as the descriptions of manorial obligations, often mention the shared nature of resources like wells and the common labor associated with their use and maintenance. Equally relentless was the need for fuel, primarily firewood, to keep the hearth burning. Carolingian winter was harsh, and without a constant supply of heat, life in a wattle and daub hut would be unbearable. But finding and transporting firewood was a monumental task. Forests, often belonging to the lord, were the primary source, and rights to gather wood were usually restricted and often required a portion to be given to the lord. Imagine venturing into the dense woods, armed with perhaps a crude axe, or simply your bare hands searching for fallen branches, dead wood, or small trees that could be felled. This was not a quick trip to a timber yard. It was a laborious expedition, often requiring hours of searching and strenuous effort. Once found, the wood needed to be prepared. Smaller branches could be broken by hand or over a knee, but larger logs required chopping. While men might fell larger trees, women were often responsible for gathering and processing smaller pieces, splitting logs, and preparing kindling. This involved repetitive movements, the swing of an axe or the force needed to break a sturdy branch. Then came the transportation. Imagine bundling an armload of heavy, often thorny branches, tying them with a crude rope, and then carrying them back to the dwelling. The weight could be immense, pulling at your shoulders, straining your back. For those without access to a donkey or cart, every single piece of wood had to be carried by human power. Children would often assist gathering smaller twigs, learning the critical importance of fuel from a young age beyond firewood. Other forms of fuel were also gathered. Dried dung, particularly from cattle, was a common fuel source in areas where wood was scarce. Imagine meticulously collecting dried animal droppings, often by hand, and then drying them further in the sun to ensure they would burn efficiently. This was dirty, often smelly work, but absolutely essential for cooking and warmth. Peat, if available in bogs, was another fuel source, requiring digging and drying, often involving women in its extraction. Constant replenishment of the fuel supply was a daily, seasonal, and lifelong commitment, dictated by the relentless cold and the demands of the cooking fire. The implications of this relentless labor extended beyond mere physical exertion. The constant exposure to the elements during these trips, rain, snow, wind, and scorching sun, contributed to premature aging, chapped skin, and chronic ailments. The risk of injury, from falls on uneven terrain to cuts from axes or thorny branches, was ever present. The need for water and fuel also restricted the geographical mobility of a serf woman. She had to live within reasonable carrying distance of these vital resources. This wasn't about leisure, it was about survival. The heavy buckets and cumbersome bundles of wood were not just burdens, they were the very lifelines of her family, a testament to her unending toil in the Carolingian world of 825, and every splinter of wood had to be earned through sweat and strain. Number 3. The call of the creatures and the gifts of the garden. In the intricate tapestry of a serf woman's daily labors in 825 AD, the care of animals and the cultivation of a small garden plot were not mere side tasks. They were crucial elements of household self-sufficiency and survival. These were intimate connections to living things demanding constant vigilance, patience, and often a surprising amount of physical strength. From the bleating of hungry goats to the quiet growth of a patch of herbs, the serf woman was deeply entwined with the natural world, coaxing sustenance from both creatures and soil. Imagine the dawn chorus in a Carolingian village. Amidst the chirping of birds and the distant calls of the field, there would be the rustling and stirring of the animals kept close to the dwelling. A serf family might possess a few chickens, a goose or two, perhaps a pig, and, if fortunate, a cow or a few sheep. While communal herds were often managed by male villagers, the daily intimate care of these smaller domestic animals often fell to the women. This meant waking before the sun, venturing into the small, often muddy enclosure where the animals were kept, and beginning the chores. Chickens needed to be fed, often with scraps from the previous day's meager meals or grain husks. Eggs, if any had been laid, were collected with care, each one a precious protein-rich gift. Geese, though formidable in their territoriality, needed attention, and their eggs and feathers were also valuable. The most demanding animal care task, if a family possessed a cow or goats, was milking. Imagine the chill of the early morning as you settle onto a small stool beside the animal, your hands often raw from other labors, expertly grasping the teats. The rhythmic squeeze and pull, the steady stream of warm milk into the wooden pail. This was a daily ritual, rain or shine, in sickness or in health. Milking required strength in the hands and arms, patience, and a calm demeanor to avoid startling the animal. The milk itself was a lifeline, providing vital nutrients for children and a base for other dairy products. And indeed, the processing of milk was another significant labor. Fresh milk spoiled quickly in a world without refrigeration, so it needed to be transformed. Imagine the hours spent churning butter, a repetitive, often strenuous task involving a wooden churn and a plunger, pushing and pulling until the cream separated into golden butter and buttermilk. Consistent rhythm, the increasing resistance of the churn, the eventual reward of the pale, fresh butter. It was a true test of endurance. Cheesemaking was even more complex, requiring careful heating, the addition of rennet, often from a calf's stomach, the pressing of the curds, and then the careful aging of the cheese. This knowledge, passed down through generations, was essential for preserving this valuable food source for months. Archaeological evidence of dairy production, including remnants of cheese presses, supports the pervasive nature of these activities in early medieval European settlements. Beyond the dairy, the care of pigs involved gathering scraps and foraging for their food, often guiding them to appropriate foraging areas. Their droppings were vital for fertilizing the small garden plots. Even the simple act of maintaining a clean space for the animals, mucking out their pens, was a heavy, often unpleasant chore, involving shoveling heavy, foul-smelling waste. The constant interaction with animals also meant exposure to parasites and diseases, adding another layer of challenge to their daily lives. Then there was the garden, a small plot of land adjacent to the dwelling, distinct from the vast communal fields. This was often a woman's particular domain, a space where she could cultivate a more diverse array of crops essential for daily sustenance and medicinal needs. Imagine turning the soil with a small hoe or a spade, preparing the beds by hand, breaking up stubborn clumps of earth. Seeds of cabbage, carrots, onions, turnips, and leeks would be carefully planted, each one a hope for future meals. Planting and weeding of the garden was meticulous work, often done on hands and knees, tending to each delicate seedling with personal care. But the garden offered more than just common vegetables. It was also the source of vital herbs and medicinal plants. Imagine carefully cultivating chamomile for soothing teas, comfrey for healing wounds, or mugwort for various ailments. The knowledge of these plants, their properties, and their uses was a precious inheritance passed from mother to daughter. Foraging in the nearby woods and meadows complemented the garden's bounty, bringing in wild berries, mushrooms, nuts, and additional medicinal plants. This required a keen eye, a deep understanding of the local flora, and careful navigation of potentially dangerous terrain. The risk of encountering wild animals or poisonous plants was always present. This aspect of a woman's labor contributed directly to the health and well-being of her family, acting as the primary kikarbor and herbalist. The care of creatures and the tending of the garden were labors that tied a serf woman deeply to the cycles of nature. They were constant, intimate, and utterly essential. The bleating of a goat, the crackling of the fire under a cheese vat, the vibrant green of a growing herb, these were the sounds and sights of her unwavering commitment, providing daily food, healing remedies, and a measure of self-reliance that buffered the harsh realities of Carolingian existence. The work was demanding, but the rewards were immediate and tangible. A pail of fresh milk, a handful of vibrant herbs, a handful of precious eggs, all contributing to the survival of her family in a world that offered little in the way of surplus or luxury. Number 2. The unseen choreography of household management. While the visible labors of field, loom, and hearth consumed immense physical energy, an equally grueling, though often less recognized, daily burden for serf women in 825 AD was the ceaseless, complex choreography of household management and child-rearing. This was an invisible weight, a mental and emotional labor that underlay every other task, demanding constant vigilance, organization, and problem-solving in a world utterly devoid of modern conveniences. It was the orchestration of survival, the daily battle against chaos, grime, and disease. Imagine the confines of a small, often single-room dwelling shared by an entire family, sometimes even with small animals. There was no running water, no dedicated kitchen, no separate bedrooms. Every aspect of daily living happened in this confined space. Maintaining even a basic level of cleanliness was an uphill battle. Dust, dirt, and straw were constantly tracked in from out. Cleaning meant sweeping the packed earth floor with a broom made of twigs, periodically refreshing the straw bedding, and perhaps scrubbing wooden surfaces with sand and water. This was not a quick swipe. It was repetitive, often uncomfortable work, especially if the ground was damp or the air was thick with smoke. The ongoing effort to keep the dwelling habitable was a daily grind, essential for health but rarely appreciated. The responsibility for the family's clothing extended beyond just making it. Laundry was a Herculean task. Imagine clothes made of coarse wool or linen soiled from labor, sweat, and grime. There were no washing machines, no detergents. Laundry often involved long trips to a river or stream, even in freezing weather. Clothes would be pounded against rocks or scrubbed with sand and lye, ash, and water, then rinsed in the cold water. The sheer physical exertion of wringing out heavy water-soaked fabric, carrying it back to the dwelling, and then laying it out to dry, often draped over bushes or a simple line, was immense. This was not a daily task due to its laboriousness, but perhaps once every few weeks, consuming an entire day, or several days, from dawn till dusk. The very notion of cleanliness was a constant, arduous pursuit. Beyond the physical maintenance of the home, a serf woman was the primary carolar and educator for her children. Children were not sent to school. They learned by doing, by observing, and by participating in the daily rhythm of labor. From a very young age, often as toddlers, children would be strapped to their mother's back while she performed chores, or allowed to play nearby, gradually introduced to simple tasks. Imagine trying to grind grain or spin thread with a crying infant needing attention or a curious toddler getting into mischief. The demands of childcare were constant, without rest. Breastfeeding was prolonged, often lasting for several years, as it was the most reliable source of nutrition for infants. This meant a constant physical drain on the mother, even as she performed other strenuous tasks. Teaching essential skills was another invisible labor. A serf woman had to impart all the knowledge necessary for survival: how to tend the garden, how to spin and weave, how to prepare and preserve food, how to care for animals, how to find and gather wild edibles, how to recognize medicinal plants. This wasn't formal instruction. It was a constant hands-on apprenticeship that began in childhood and continued throughout adolescence. It required patience, repetition, and the ability to guide and correct, while simultaneously completing her own endless duties. The very survival of the family depended on her ability to raise competent, hard-working offspring. Historical evidence from early medieval legal codes and social norms indicates the strong expectation for women to manage the domestic sphere and raise children, seeing this as their inherent contribution to society. Furthermore, a serf woman was the family's health guardian. With no doctors readily available, she was the first, and often only, line of defense against illness and injury. She would administer herbal remedies, tend to cuts and scrapes, ease fevers, and comfort the sick. Constant worry about the well-being of her children, especially in an era of high infant mortality and rampant disease, added a profound emotional burden to her already overloaded existence. A sick child meant even less rest, more worry, and the desperate hope for recovery. The management of resources was also her purview. She had to stretch meager supplies, make do with what was available, and ensure nothing went to waste. Every scrap of food, every worn piece of cloth, every useful bone was carefully utilized. This required foresight, ingenuity, and a constant assessment of the family's immediate needs versus their long-term survival. Planning of meals, the allocation of limited resources, the repair of tools or clothing, these were decisions and tasks that fell squarely on her shoulders. The unseen choreography of household management was a relentless, multifaceted labor, demanding not only physical strength, but also immense mental fortitude, organizational skills, and an unwavering commitment to the survival and well-being of her family in the harsh Carolingian world. It was the silent, steady hum of the home, always working, always planning, always enduring. Number 1. The weight of social obligations and the price of community. Even amidst the grinding physical realities of their daily existence, serf women in 825 AD carried another significant, though often invisible burden: the weight of social obligations and the inescapable demands of community. Life in a Carolingian village, particularly for a serf, was not lived in isolation. Every individual was part of a tightly knit, hierarchical system, and women were expected to uphold their part of this intricate social contract, often through additional unpaid labor and communal duties that extended beyond their immediate household. These were the costs of belonging, the price of the precarious safety and support offered by a collective existence. Imagine the expectation of contributing to the Lord's domain. As serfs, women were bound to the land and to the Lord, not just by birth, but by labor. Beyond the specified agricultural work in the fields, women often had to provide specific services or goods to the manor. This might include duties in the Lord's household, such as spinning and weaving cloth for the Lord's family, baking bread in the manorial oven, often a task that came with a fee of flour or bread, or assisting in the preparation of food for feast days. These services, known as corvée or labor services, were often uncompensated and could pull a woman away from her own pressing household duties, exacerbating the pressure on her time and energy. Think of the extra miles walked to the manor house, the hours spent toiling for another's benefit, knowing that your own family's needs waited unattended. Charlemagne's Capitular de Villiers, though an ideal rather than a universal reality, provides insight into the detailed organization of manorial estates and the varied services expected from all members of the laboring population, implicitly including women's contributions beyond the fields. Beyond direct feudal obligations, communal duties were also a constant presence. While the specific nature varied, the support of neighbors, especially during times of crisis, was paramount for survival. If a neighbor fell ill, if a birth was difficult, if a dwelling needed repair, women would often be among the first to offer assistance. This meant diverting precious time and energy from their own overwhelming chores to help others, often receiving no direct remuneration in return. Imagine the expectation of helping a neighbor with their harvest during a crucial period, even if your own crops were at risk. This Reciprocity was the glue of the community, but it was also a continuous drain on individual resources. Tending communal gatherings, even if for social or religious purposes, also represented a form of labor. Village meetings, often held after Mass, were places where important decisions were made, disputes were heard, and announcements relayed. While women might not have had a direct voice in formal decisions, their presence was often expected, and it took time away from other tasks. Religious observations, such as regular attendance at Mass or participating in seasonal festivals, also required preparation and time. These were not leisure activities. They were integral to the social fabric and moral obligations of the community, and women played a vital role in upholding them. The burden of care for the elderly and infirm within the village often fell disproportionately on women. In a world without dedicated healthcare or social welfare systems, the care of those unable to work was a communal responsibility, largely discharged through informal networks, with women at the forefront. Imagine tending to an elderly relative who could no longer perform their chores, bathing them, feeding them, comforting them all while managing your own young children and endless daily tasks. This was an act of profound compassion, but also a significant additional labor, often performed with few resources and little external support. Even the simple act of maintaining social harmony within the village, diffusing disputes or offering emotional support, could be considered a form of invisible labor. Women were often the primary communicators within extended families and immediate communities, sharing news, organizing informal exchanges of goods or services, and mediating personal conflicts. This constant engagement, while fostering community bonds, also consumed mental and emotional energy, adding to the overall stress of their lives. The expectations surrounding women's roles in marriage and family also imposed significant social obligations. A woman was expected to marry, to bear children, and to fulfill her role as a wife and mother within the prevailing social structure. The pressure to conform to these norms, to contribute to the family's labor force through reproduction, and to maintain a respectable household reputation, was a powerful unspoken force. Daughters were raised to replicate their mother's tireless work ethic and to embody the skills necessary for survival within their social strata. Ultimately, the weight of social obligations for serf women in Carolingian times was pervasive and multi-layered. It wasn't just about physical labor. It was about the constant negotiation of their time, energy, and resources within a rigid social hierarchy and a demanding communal structure. These duties, though often unquantified in historical records, were as essential to the functioning of society as the turning of the soil or the weaving of cloth. They were the threads that bound communities together. But for the serf woman, they were also another set of invisible chains, constantly pulling at her strength, reminding her that her life was not her own, but a part of a larger, unrelenting system of shared burdens and collective survival.